Okay, good day, everybody from GACOR. Before I start, I just want to remind you, make sure you stay muted during the talk and keep off your cameras, keeps our bandwidth. We're really delighted today to have Monica Gattinger, who you've already seen a bit of her background, but just to recap just very briefly, she's a PhD in public policy, Carleton U, and directs the Institute for Science Society Policy at U of Ottawa, so crosses roads at both universities. And she's really quite extensive in both government, civil society, academic, published widely, and she's also on the panel for electrification, for upgrading electrification and energy transition for Ontario. So it'll be very interesting to hear what she has to say. We're really looking forward to this. And Monica, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Richard, for that kind introduction. And thank you to GACOR for the invitation to speak with you this afternoon. It's a true honor, and I'm just delighted to be here. Really looking forward to the discussion portion of the presentation. As Richard mentioned, I am a member of the Government of Ontario's Electrification and Energy Transition Panel. I should just clarify that my remarks today are being delivered in my personal capacity, and the legalese of this does not represent the views of the panel. So this is me from the University of Ottawa speaking to you today. I'd also like to recognize that I'm joining the session today from the unceded territory of the Algonquin people in Ottawa, and delighted to be here. So I'm just going to get started with the presentation without further ado, and I trust if there are any technical issues or some reason to jump in, Richard, you will let me know that something needs attention. So Richard already presented the title of the talk here. You saw it on the previous slide, and really what I'm going to be trying to do in this talk is to lay out some of the key issues when it comes to how do we what are some of the key barriers when it comes to public confidence, and by that I'm referring to the confidence of individual Canadians, Indigenous peoples, investors, and sometimes in some instances governments themselves in emissions reductions on the road to net zero. So what are some of the key kind of obstacles or barriers, and then what are some thinking that we can do to try to overcome them so that we can get some efficient, effective, and durable emissions reductions in Canada? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the research and engagement program that I've been leading at the University of Ottawa now for going on a decade, actually. It's called Positive Energy, and we've been exploring these issues, conducting research and pretty extensive engagement on these issues for the last number of years. So I'll be drawing on that work in the context of the presentation. And then, as I indicated, I'll be focusing in on a number of obstacles, barriers, opportunities. You could look at them through that lens as well, but predominantly the work that we've been doing is really trying to identify where are some of the hurdles to emissions reductions, and what can we do to try to overcome those challenges. I'll be zeroing in on 4 key challenges. One of them has to do with infrastructure. So looking at, in the context of reducing emissions, that's going to require really a wholesale transformation of our energy systems and broader economy, which will require a substantial capital investment in new energy infrastructure of all types. And that is becoming increasingly an area where a lot of attention is being paid to how do we ensure that we are able to get infrastructure financed, permitted, and built, and related technologies developed and deployed. So I'll spend some time on that. I'm going to be talking about energy affordability and reliability. I think maybe it's important to point out that my own background is in energy. So I come to questions of climate change and emissions reductions through the door of energy, and somebody who's been studying energy policy and regulation for, I hate to admit it, but going on 3 decades. So really some of those key imperatives, energy imperatives, are where my mind goes when I think about how do we get sustainable durable emissions reductions. The third area is going to be looking at ensuring that we have, consensus and support from the public and also from experts in the energy and climate community. So the research that we've been doing at Positive Energy is focused not only on broader public opinion, but also the opinions of, sort of so-called experts, folks who are very much, in the know and directly engaged in the energy and climate milieu. And then the final area is around intergovernmental collaboration and some of the challenges that we have seen and are continuing to see on polarization when it comes to energy and climate change, and particular polarization along partisan lines. So I'll spend a little bit of time on that. And then, not wanting this presentation to leave off on a negative note, I'll certainly be putting some effort into, over the course of the presentation and closer to the end, identifying what are some of the areas of solution seeking to identify a constructive path forward. A good part of our work is about kind of framing up the challenges, but more than anything, it's also about how do we address those challenges and overcome them. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Positive Energy, so you've got a bit of a sense of where we're coming from, the work that we've been doing, the approach that we've been taking to the research that I'll be sharing with you today. So we are a research and engagement program at the University of Ottawa. We are based out of the Institute for Science, Society and Policy. As Richard mentioned, I'm director of the Institute. We have a number of different research streams at the Institute, or research clusters, we call them. One of them is in energy, but we've got other clusters in areas like science advice and artificial intelligence and robotics, inclusive innovation, a variety of topics. But Positive Energy sits in our energy cluster. And the mandate of our work there is about how to strengthen public confidence in energy policy, regulation, and decision making. We do, a lot of research and analysis and a lot of engagement, as you're going to hear about in a moment. So we're working very closely with people who are living and breathing these issues on a daily basis. And then through that work, we identify recommendations for action. In terms of the approach that we take, I like to think of it as sort of a two-pronged approach. The first part of the approach is to use the convening power of the university to bring together key leaders in the energy and climate space, from industry, from government, from Indigenous organizations, from environmental NGOs, and academia, to kind of bring those folks together around what are some of the key challenges, how can we work together to address them. And then I lead a research team, and depending on what we're working on, it's anywhere from kind of half a dozen to 10 to up to 20 researchers who undertake solution-focused research on particular topic areas that have been identified through our engagement. We've approached our work through three phases. So the first phase from 20, and this is why I say we've been doing this for almost a decade now, really focused in on public confidence in energy decision making in the sort of, how shall I put it, in that particular period. So people, if you cast your mind back to 2015, 2014, sort of in and around that time, there was a tremendous amount of contentiousness in the country, notably around pipelines. And so there was, some effort that was put into trying to identify why are we seeing some of these big challenges and opposition and contentiousness around energy project decision making. And yes, pipelines were, very much the headline at that time, but there were also, here in Ontario, people will know that there were some challenges for wind energy as well. So we were looking at, how can we better understand why we're seeing some of these issues. In the second phase of our work, then we looked, we began to cast our attention a little bit further into the future, looking at Canada's energy future in an age of climate change. So really starting to anchor our work much more in that energy climate nexus. And then in this third phase that we're currently in, we're focusing on net zero and how do we try to ensure that we've got ongoing public confidence on the road to net zero. One thing I'll just note, for the folks here, is that this was supposed to be a 3-year project, but these challenges are complex and enduring. They have many tentacles, and over the course of that first 3 years, we built, a very a network and a platform and a forum that filled a need. And so the folks who were engaged with our work, when we came close to the end of that 3-year period, were very much encouraging us to continue. So we have continued since then. So here, I won't go through this in extensive detail, but I'll just point to you just to give you a sense of our network. So we have a multiplicity of financial supporters that span the energy system writ large. So everything, yes, from oil and gas, but all the way through to electricity, renewable energy, nuclear energy. So this is very much an energy conversation. We've had funding as well from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. We've also worked closely with policy departments, including Natural Resources Canada. And, one of the communities, if you want to refer to it in that way, that has really been very interested in our work are energy regulators. So we have very strong connections with energy regulators across the country, whether resource regulators or economic and utility regulators. We have an advisory council that we meet with on a quarterly basis. It is there to, help to ensure that the work that we're undertaking continues to be relevant, is mobilized as well as it can be to folks who would be interested. Nick Nanos, people will probably know Nick. Nick chairs our advisory council. We have a very close and constructive partnership with Nanos Research. They are our official pollster, and you're going to be hearing some of the findings of our work with them today. In terms of research collaboration, our view is that these problems and challenges and issues are just so multifaceted and complex. We're not there to compete with others. We're very much there to collaborate. So you'll see a few examples here of folks that we've collaborated with, organizations, institutions we've collaborated with over time. We've developed close relationships and research partnerships with Camput, which is the organization that brings together all of Canada's energy regulators, and more recently with the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, which is just a tremendous organization that is working on capacity building in First Nations communities to engage with major projects. So that's a bit about positive energy. Now we can move on to the topic of the day. So this whole question of public confidence on the road to net zero, and I'll be identifying and talking you through some of the key challenges that we've seen in our work, and then some of the pathways in terms of solution spaces or areas where we can find some ways to address some of the challenges and obstacles. So I'll move through each of the 4 areas that I highlighted in the overview slide in turn. So the first one is around getting infrastructure financed, permitted and built, and technology developed and deployed. And so I've got a number of images over the course of the next few slides. And so folks on this call or on this session might say, well, we're not, when we're talking about climate change, we're not talking about how do we get more pipelines built, we're talking about other things. And the reason I've included this photo here, this image here, is that as somebody who's been, studying energy for quite some time, I can recall when, there was just so much contentiousness around pipelines in Canada. If you cast your mind back to kind of 2013, 2014, 2015, it was Northern Gateway, it was the Trans Mountain Pipeline, it was Keystone XL, it was Energy East. We had all these, major pipelines proposals that were generating tremendous amount of controversy and conflict and opposition. And at that time, which was around the time we started positive energy, we were working really closely with government policymakers and regulators to try to reform decision-making systems for major projects to try to strengthen public confidence in those systems. And at that period of time, one of our major recommendations and messages to governments were to say, like, yes, today it's pipelines, but don't forget, tomorrow it could be electricity transmission lines. It could be hydrogen projects. It could be, all sorts of renewable projects. And we actually undertook a very extensive study looking at a variety of different energy projects across the country, everything from pipelines to transmission lines to wind projects, a variety of different kinds of energy projects, to try to identify what were some of the drivers of community, like local communities' confidence in energy project decision making. So I think, a lot of the reforms that were taken, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but a lot of the reforms that were taken in that sort of 2015, 2016 period were taken predominantly because of, the heat and light that was emanating from pipeline protests. But those are now the systems that are the same systems we're going to be utilizing for permitting lower emitting energy infrastructure going forward. And one of the things that we hear very frequently in our engagement with policymakers, industry, regulators, is there's a lot of concern about, are we going to be able to build enough fast enough in order to reduce our emissions on the road to 2050. So I've got a few, additional images here, and we recognize that many renewable projects are extremely well supported by communities, but we also recognize that it is, it's leaves one vulnerable to assume that they will be supported by communities. So we are beginning to see some pushback, and we have seen pushback in recent years over different kinds of projects that would not only be providing renewable power. I'll give another example here, but also delivering electricity from one jurisdiction to another jurisdiction. And so one of the things that's come forward very strongly in our work is that, for local communities, in some instances for them, it's actually local environmental impacts that are prioritized over global climate impacts. And I think that's a really important thing that proponents, governments, regulators really need to be aware of, because if we are to achieve net zero by 2050, it is going to require just a wholesale transformation of our energy systems and broader economy, which will require a tremendous amount of new energy infrastructure of all kinds. And so we need to think through, how do we make sure that we've got decision systems that will, as much as is feasible, bring people along in that process and foster public confidence and public support in that process, and not generate, situations where we've got wholesale or large scale opposition to projects, because that will definitely slow things down. So this is the question: can we build enough fast enough? So I'm going to run through some of the key challenges here. This is an area where we have done a tremendous amount of work and are continuing to do a tremendous amount of work. I could talk about it for days. So I am disappointed I won't be able to be with you for perhaps as long as we might like, but I'm going to run through some of the challenges. And so I've pointed to this stage to challenges at that local level of individual citizens and community members, but there are also challenges and opportunities when it comes to investor confidence in decision-making frameworks for new major projects, and also for Indigenous communities as well. So what are some of the what are some of the challenges? One of the biggest ones that that we hear regularly from investors, and if you look at any of the estimates of the capital expenditures that will be required to move Canada's energy system and broader economy to a net zero configuration, we are talking about billions, hundreds of billions of dollars. McKinsey has estimated it at 1.3 trillion to 2050, with over half of that needing to be spent before 2030. So, that's certainly not all going to come from governments. There's going to be a requirement there for private capital. And that, one of the things we hear very regularly from the private sector is that the lack of policy certainty around, some pretty big policy levers that have yet to be clarified make it very challenging to come to a place of confidence in making major commitments for major projects. And I think it's important to recognize that this challenge is outside of the scope of project approvals. This is, the broader policy regulatory framework within which project economics are shaped. So I give a few examples here at the federal level. We are still waiting on what the finer details will be on the clean electricity regulations. There's multiple investment tax credits the government has committed to putting into place. There's still a lot of details yet to come on that. They've committed to an oil and gas emissions cap. A lot of details yet to come on that. We have legislation on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, still waiting on implementation guidance for that. And these are just a few examples, but those are very big policy. That much larger policy umbrella is going to shape project economics, and that's one area that is quite challenging, I think, for investors. The same thing could be said, but with different examples at the provincial level. Here in Canada, we all know we're a federation. We don't always get alignment or coordination between the federal government and provincial governments around, large questions of public policy and regulation. And then add on top of that, of course, that there's always the risk of policy reversals if a new government is elected into power. And so, if you're an investor, these are the sorts of things that I think keep you up at night, or at least give you pause, even if there are projects that you're very keen to move forward on that will be helpful for Canada in terms of net zero. So that's policy uncertainty. Then you get into the whole question of project approvals and permitting. Lots of challenges there. One of the things we hear frequently right now from government leaders at the federal level, but also provincially to some extent as well, is about timeliness and making sure that project decisions can be taken in a timely fashion. We've had ministers talk about the importance of, or the need to fast track project approvals, but the work that we have done in this space is demonstrates pretty strongly that the challenge is, yes, timelines and timeliness is one of them, but beyond that, you can think of investor confidence as like a three-legged stool. One leg is making sure that that there are reasonably rapid decisions that get taken, but another leg is clarity of the rules. So you have a lot of investors that will say, give me if I would far rather take a longer, have a decision process that takes a longer time, but for which I know the rules are clear. And there's still quite a bit of lack of clarity of the rules for evaluating projects. This is particularly the case at the federal level for impact assessment around a variety of different areas that are noted here on the slide. Designation, which projects will and will not require impact assessment, how will impacts be scoped, how will cumulative effects be addressed in assessments, what are the requirements for Indigenous consultation. So, there has been some guidance provided on these issues by governments, but there's still quite a lot of lack of clarity there. There's a lot of lack of clarity as well around the way in which Indigenous-led impact assessment and regulation will be undertaken. So increasingly we're seeing, and it's a really positive development, Indigenous communities becoming much more involved in impact assessment for projects. So they are, developing their own standards for impact assessment, undertaking their own assessments of projects through an impact lens, and in the process, either becoming, quasi regulators or wholesale regulators of projects. And yet it's still not clear, certainly for somebody like me who's been studying energy policy and regulation for quite a long time, it's not clear to me how those processes align with, work with, interface with some of the federal and provincial impact assessment and project approval processes. Another thing that we see, so there's the question of clarity. Another dimension of this is also predictability. So many of the reforms that we've seen taken in project decision making by governments over the last number of years have seen a much greater role for politicians, whether it's individual ministers or cabinet as a whole, in project decision making. So you've got, a project that makes its way through a regulatory process, and then sort of the final step is that a recommendation lands on a cabinet table or lands on a minister's desk, and then a final decision needs to get taken. And that opens up a lot of lack of predictability for investors concerned that sort of new considerations or political considerations will be entered into decision making at the final hour. So again, back to this question of timelines. So yes, it's good to have decision processes that are timely in terms of not taking too long for the government to make a decision about whether a project is approved or not and under what conditions. But over and above that, there are questions around ensuring that rules are clear for everybody. It's not just for investors, it's for those who are involved in other ways in projects as well, and that the decisions will be taken in a predictable way. We've got other questions too around permitting. There's a lot of permits that are required for projects. There's sort of quite a few questions being posed around is there some way to streamline some of those processes? Are there ways that risks could be managed differently in the permitting system? And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And then, the last point on the slide here is system capacity. So, if we're thinking about the volume of projects that will need to be financed, permitted, constructed, brought into service, do we have the human resources and just system capacity in governments to be able to assess that volume of activity? So lest this starts to sound too negative, or it's all challenges. There are definitely not only challenges here. There's a lot of opportunities for solution seeking. Certainly on the policy side of things, there's the at one level you can say, well, are we ever really going to get policy clarity, certainty? I don't think we'll ever get 100% clarity and certainty on policies, but one thing I think is that governments are becoming increasingly aware that they need to, move with, move as expeditiously as they can on policies to provide that kind of clarity and certainty for investors. In terms of project decision making, there are opportunities there that I'll point to a few of them here. I was talking about permitting a moment ago. We've got federal permitting processes, we've got provincial permitting processes. Many of those permits are crossing multiple government departments at both levels of government. Would there be ways in which we could sequence or streamline some of those processes to ensure that we're actually moving forward in a more expeditious fashion, and ensuring also that we are prioritizing the mitigation and attenuation of risks in a meaningful way, but also in a way that ensures we are learning about, if there are risks that are well understood, perhaps we should be focusing more attention on the risks that are less well understood. There's a lot of opportunity, I think, here for federal, provincial, and Indigenous collaboration around assessments and around regulation. This is very much a burgeoning new area. It's going to take some time and some thoughtful approaches to have those various levels of government and Indigenous organizations come together and to identify, how do we move forward on project approvals in a way that respects Indigenous rights, title, and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and also is ensuring that federal and provincial requirements are met as well. So lots of work to do there. I think the final thing I'd note here is that, in terms of the involvement of cabinets and ministers in decision making, it could be quite helpful for cabinets to identify a little bit of, guardrails, as it were, or provisions that lay out and scope more clearly how they will or won't engage in the approval or not of individual projects. I think we're very at Positive Energy. We're very much on the message about proceeding really carefully with fast tracking, because we do, at the end of the day, need to make sure that we have decision-making processes that people have confidence in, for which Indigenous communities have been meaningfully engaged, consulted, provided opportunities for developing partnerships, equity participation, and the like. And if desires to move forward more expeditiously with decisions means that we're doing short shrift on whether it's Indigenous involvement in decision making or the adequate assessment of risks and attenuating risks and identifying risks, then we're really going to run the risk of losing public confidence in decisions. So that's the first piece, and I spent quite a bit on that one. I'm going to start to pick up the pace a bit here, or I know Richard's going to tell me I better pick it up. So that's on that side of things. The second area that I wanted to spend a little bit of time on is ensuring that energy is reliable and affordable as we move forward on emissions reductions. So I like to start with the definition of energy security of the International Energy Agency, just to give a sense of where I'm coming from on this. And so their definition is ensuring the uninterrupted availability of energy sources at an affordable price. So there's really sort of three components to energy security identified in this definition, one of which is the availability of energy. So energy must be available, but it also must be reliable. So that's the uninterrupted piece, and then affordability as well. And all of those dimensions are going to be really important as we move forward on emissions reductions and as we move on the road to net zero. I think one of the reasons that we haven't necessarily seen a lot of focus in policy on energy reliability and affordability is that our energy systems, for the most part, have done a very good job of providing us with reliable and affordable energy. As we transform our energy systems, as we do more to electrify, ensuring that that's done in a way that maintains reliable and affordable energy will be absolutely crucial in order to ensure that we continue to have the much needed public support for emissions reductions. And that from an economic perspective, that we are providing the reliable, affordable energy that industry will be needing in terms of economic activity. So I'm going to walk through this in a little bit here, but I'm going to spend most of the attention on sort of the public component, the citizen component to this. So I like to start with this image, and I know that we're not moving into Q&A yet, but I'd like to start with this image, and my guess is that this group will probably see right away why I've selected this image. So this, as you can see, is North America at night. It is showing all of the lights coming from our electricity systems, and I love using this image with students because I say, what's wrong with this figure? And folks, I don't know if you can see my cursor here. If not, I am, moving my cursor around a big black spot. Whoops, sorry, just to the southeast of the Great Lakes, and that was the evening, some 20 years ago now almost, where about 50 million Canadians and Americans lost power. So this is a satellite image from that night on, it was August 14th, 2003, where we had, the largest blackout in North American history. Now, that was not caused by climate change. I'm not trying to make that claim, so I want to just be clear about that right there. But what I love about this image is it really demonstrates, the extent to which reliability of, in this case, electricity is so essential to the powering of our modern economy and lives. And ensuring that we've got that reliability going forward is going to be absolutely crucial, and I think a really big challenge for our electricity systems, one with which I know they are quite seized. So a couple other things I want to point to on the affordability side. We, I think, in Canada, for the most part, have done extraordinarily well in terms of reliability and affordability of energy in recent years. Folks who have been following what has been going on in the United Kingdom around gas and electricity prices will know that they have just had some tremendous challenges in terms of the affordability of gas and power in end-use markets. Now, this graph, I could have shown a more recent graph that shows, price caps that have been put in place, and of course that has had some massive implications for the balance sheets of companies, for the balance sheets of governments. But there's no question that when energy becomes unaffordable for people, it becomes a political challenge very, very quickly, and of course a social challenge. But for purposes of this presentation, I want to zero in on the political challenge, because to the extent that increases in energy prices and reliability of energy are either rightly or wrongly, and sometimes it's wrongly, attributed to climate action, that can be a very damaging development in terms of public support for emissions reductions. So something to be just so mindful of as we move forward on the road to net zero. So a few images here from Europe. Some of these challenges, as we know, over the course of the last number of years, including with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, have just led to some really challenging energy circumstances. In the United Kingdom, many would know that they were already facing a number of those challenges prior to the invasion, but it's definitely rocked energy markets, and in some instances has, I think, potentially accelerated moves to emissions reductions. In other cases, as we know, it's actually led to some reversals in terms of bringing coal back into certain systems, which is a very unfortunate development. So back here in Canada, we wanted to find out, with some of our work on public opinion, what Canadians think about topics and issues around energy prices and affordability. So we started as of the fall of last year. So this is a new question for us because this was right around the time that energy prices were beginning to jump up. We started asking Canadians about their level of concern over energy prices. And again, this is not about climate. This is just about energy prices. How concerned are people about energy prices? Recognizing that, energy prices can fluctuate for a variety of reasons. and it's important to know where Canadians are at on that topic, particularly as it might pertain to emissions reductions. So we asked people on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is not at all concerned and 10 is very concerned. How would you rate your concern for energy prices for prices you will pay for things like heating and transportation over the next 6 months? I have to say I was very surprised to see the level of concern among Canadians. I didn't share with you the slide today on breaking it down to those who scored 0, those who scored 1, those who scored 2, and on and on and on to 10. But I was, again, very surprised. 1/3 of respondents to this poll scored their level of concern at a 10. So 1 in 3 Canadians, 10 out of 10, the highest level of concern about energy prices. So that was, I think, important, sort of important context to be thinking about in terms of emissions reductions efforts and the importance of ensuring that there's reliable and affordable energy. If you look at how it splits out over the country, mindful of time, we'll just bring forward for you a few key highlights. So higher levels of concern in Atlantic Canada, in the prairies, higher levels of concern in the age group 35 to 54. In terms of ideologically and partisan affiliation, higher levels of concern among conservative voters and among rightward leaning Canadians. So we also asked Canadians about what they, sort of government performance. So what do they think is the job done by governments in Canada at ensuring energy is affordable? But if you look at the question here, at the bottom left-hand corner, do governments in Canada do a very good, average, poor, or very poor job of ensuring energy is affordable as Canada works to meet its climate change targets? So we wanted to put those two things together and identify people's perceptions. And again, this is perceptions, rightly or wrongly, perceptions about that intersection between energy affordability and climate change. And we had asked this question previously in May of 2022. And it was interesting to us, although concerning to us, to see a jump in the number of people who scored, or the percentage of people who scored government performance as very poor on this topic. So these are fairly low scores when you're asking people to rate governments. So, the positive approach to this would be to say governments have nowhere to go but up. There's a lot of room for improvement, but it's certainly something to bear in mind.
Time to start wrapping up though, Monica.
Yeah, will do. So I will be sharing the presentation with KCOR. So what I will do is skip forward to some of the other topic areas here, just to make sure that we get to the end in a timely fashion and leave lots of room for discussion. Again, I will leave this here. I did, though, not want to leave people with the perception that it's all negative news for the public. We've done a lot of public opinion polling around Canadians' views on energy and climate, and overall, Canadians do tend to agree on the big picture issues of energy and climate. And I'll just give you an illustration of this here. So we've been asking Canadians now for going on 3 years, how good of a time is it for Canada to be ambitious in addressing climate change? And fairly consistently, you've got about a half of Canadians who are saying now is the best time to be ambitious in addressing climate change, even with some of the challenges that we've seen economically over the last number of years. So I think that is very positive news. Again, mindful of time, I'll skip over some of these slides here. So I'm going to start to wrap up. The whole question of intergovernmental collaboration and partisan polarization over climate is just such a huge one for Canada. And if you look back to sort of the 2014, 2015 period of time. That would be the top image here, where you had, all of Canada's first ministers come together, almost without exception, signing on to the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. And then, we had some turnovers at the provincial level. In terms of governments and parties in power. And then, people might remember this infamous Maclean's cover image at the bottom right-hand corner, with a number of conservative premiers really starting to get into some pretty substantial controversy, including constitutional challenges with the federal government over issues involving energy and climate. So there's, I think, a big set of questions for Canada about, and I'll talk about that in a moment as I'm wrapping up here, how do we foster greater collaboration between levels of government over energy and climate? And how do we, where we can, navigate some of the partisan polarization that I think, unfortunately, is probably going to be endemic on the road ahead to emissions reductions. So what I'm going to do, actually, Richard, just mindful of time, because I really do want to make sure that we're leaving a lot of time for the discussion, is I'm going to go to these last two slides, because I do want to make sure we're ending on a positive note. The view that we have in the work that we've been doing in this space is that, Canada, as many countries, are in a period of unprecedented experimentation in policy, regulation, and programs for climate and for energy and climate. And I think, there's such an opportunity here to not only try to coordinate and align where possible, because we do see, notwithstanding the previous slide around some of the intergovernmental challenges and partisan challenges, we do see much greater alignment across the country between business, government, Canadians, around the need to reduce emissions. So that's very positive. But we need to learn what works on emissions reductions more rapidly than ever before. So a Positive Energy, of course, we are a forum to try to identify what works and what doesn't work and what needs to be scaled up. But we need multiple forums like this, forums between levels of governments, within levels of government, to try to identify what are some of the most constructive paths forward. We need to also create the space and the support, particularly for governments, to take risks. We don't always see them taking risks, to innovate and to pilot new approaches and to learn, as very, very rapidly about what needs to be done. And again, on a positive note, I see just a growing recognition and an appetite for this, particularly within governments. And I would say that our engagement with folks in industry is that they are there as well, Indigenous communities as well, very much there to try to identify and work collaboratively to strike constructive paths forward. Last slide. I think it's sometimes we forget that the pace and scale of net zero is truly unprecedented in terms of energy transition, and that in contrast to many previous energy transitions, the role of government is going to be absolutely essential in transition. And so it needs to be thought through, very carefully and mindfully of what is going to ensure that we've got durable emissions reductions. The work that we've done at Positive Energy really underscores that it's important to and crucial to address, yes, emissions reductions, but also energy imperatives as well. So other environmental impacts, the affordability, reliability, the safety and resilience of our energy systems, the investment environment, working to ensure we've got public support on an ongoing basis, and opportunities, identifying meaningful opportunities for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And I think what this requires, is that whole of system thinking, the willingness to take some risks, to learn, and to collaborate. I think, in our work, what gets me up in the morning is that I see increasingly that that's where people are at. They really want to work together to try to make this work. And so it's a matter of rolling up our sleeves and making it happen. So Richard, with that, I'll discontinue sharing my screen and I'll look forward to comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Monica. That was a great talk. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question. Um, Jeff, you're up next, so you can unmute yourself and take off your screen. So you're going to be on deck. But Monica, I'm just wondering, in one of the first slides, you showed us who you're collaborating with and so forth. But it seemed to be more petrochemical. But I'm just wondering how much is with the renewables and with groups like ORAC or so forth. So forth, and the second question is actually how likely are we to meet our goals?
Start well, the second question is the tough one. So in terms of the first question, like what we really are aiming to do is to create a a donor table, if you want to put it that way, that is representative of the broad energy system. And I don't mean representative in terms of proportions, but I mean representative of everybody who should be at the table is at the table. We have had, the Canadian Wind Energy Association, now CanREA, has been at our table. Electricity Canada, to your question, it is at our table. We would like to expand that more. So one of the challenges that we have found, I would note, and I hope that this will change with time, is that some of the emerging energy, whether it's technologies or sources, we usually connect either with individual companies or with industry associations. And they don't have necessarily, because they're relatively new into the marketplace, they don't necessarily have deep pockets. So it can be challenging for them to contribute to our work. That said, we try to make as much space as we can. So on our advisory committee, for example, we do make sure that we've got a diversity of voices, including folks who are working in the renewable energy space. Specific to your question, Richard, can we do better and should we do better? Absolutely. Absolutely. I think one of the other areas that we want to expand into, so you're mentioning about renewables. I think one of the other areas we would very much like to expand into is, the financial community as well, because investment in projects, research, new technologies, commercialization, scale up, all of those issues are going to be absolutely crucial going forward, and having that voice kind of at the table will be important. Having said that, so the slide that you were referring to, those are just the folks who are, they're contributing to our work financially. They're around the table in terms of our advisory council. But when we're undertaking, whether it's workshops or conferences, public events, we've got everybody around the table. So the invitation is open to all. We held a session on hydrogen about a year or two ago now, and 500 plus people registered, coming from across the entire energy system. So certainly that is our aim, and it's it's a moving target though. Our energy systems are changing, so it's part of what makes it fun. To your second question, I mean, this is a tough one because I think there's, I come to questions of energy and climate through the social sciences. I'm a social scientist. So, if you look at the climate science, it's clear. This is where our targets are developed from, right? The targets are developed based on climate science and, 1.5 degrees and net zero by 2050. And then, and this is, the where my mind goes as a social scientist. Okay, well, how are we going to, make that happen in, the worlds of our economies, political, social, communities, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, the challenges to develop policy in a rapid way that's comprehensive, that's holistic, the challenges of reforming our regulatory systems. It is tough for me to imagine that the speed of social science is going to be as rapid as what the climate science suggests. Having said that, I don't think that's any reason to say, well, we can't meet our targets, so let's forget about it. Absolutely not. I think, all the more reason, at least from our perspective, to roll up our sleeves and say, okay, what do we need to do to more rapidly reform our policy and regulatory systems to, build capacity for Indigenous communities to engage in emissions reductions efforts. And that's, I think, where we're coming at with, let's identify what some of the key challenges or obstacles are, through that social science lens, and then work constructively and collaboratively to identify how to navigate and overcome them.
Interesting. Well, it's on that note, I'll let Bill Reese know that he's up next. But just on that note, when the financial institutions, they're not doing so well when you're looking at the ESG scoring. So yeah, it's a bit concerning there.
Yeah.
But Bill, you have a comment. And after that will be John Legg.
Yes, thank you, Monica. I am a scientist. I'm an ecologist and actually an energy analyst as well. And my question is, what if there's no valid basis for public confidence in net zero? There's plenty of significant research out there that says it's a fantasy unless there are major reductions in total energy availability. So I just wonder what you think of that.
Well, I'm not sure which part to grab onto in that question. I think, one of the things that, that I worry a bit about is commitments have been made, let's say in the case of net zero. And, we've done a lot of public opinion research asking Canadians about their level of confidence in government performance across a whole host of issues, including emissions reductions. And the confidence scores are just so low, so low. So it's, we ask people, poor, very poor, good, very good. And I remember the first time some of the scores came back in research that we were doing, I asked Nick, I said, Nick, these scores look really low. So it'd be, confidence in Canada's ability to reduce emissions or government's performance on emissions reductions. And 2% of Canadians would say very good. Maybe, a few percent would say good. Bunch of folks in the middle who kind of aren't really sure. And then the vast, plurality of folks in the poor, very poor. And, and Nick's response was, because I asked him, is this just the case that people always score governments poorly? And so we should sort of take this with a grain of salt because that's what, that's how people view governments. And he said, no, Monica, this is actually really bad. This is worse than it typically is. So these actually really are low scores. So to your question, one of the things I worry about is that if people feel that governments are making commitments that are not credible and that they're not capable of, moving energy systems to be able to achieve those objectives, does that reduce people's willingness to make any change at all? And I don't think we're there yet, but it does concern me greatly if we don't have the public along, and by that I mean public support. If we don't have public support for emissions reductions, right now we have it. There's the very strong support there, but if that gets lost, I worry tremendously about the country's capacity, whether it's this country or other countries' capacity to undertake meaningful emissions reductions, leaving aside whether or not they will be at the level that climate science is dictating.
Yeah, but I guess my question is that it may be that the public are correct, that there is no valid basis for thinking we can achieve net zero by 2050. You've mentioned several times the massive investment required to begin this journey, which we're not making, by the way. Yeah. And secondly, there are many, many competing values in society, from healthcare to housing. Yeah. All saying the same thing about the massive investment needed as our population increases by 1 million people a year.
Well, I guess maybe I'd kind of put it back to you then, Bill, and not to be sidestepping, but I think where I come to on that is, does that mean we should throw up our hands and say, forget it? I don't think so. I mean, I do see in the work that we've done that Canadians, for the most part, they do want to move on emissions reductions. It's, show us a way that we can do this, that's feasible, that's going to, be politically and economically sustainable and durable, that's going to be effective. I think that's I think we're at that inflection point. That's where we're at. So our work would suggest that the appetite is there, but not necessarily a lot of confidence in governments to get us there. So there's, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because I think our view would be, well, that wouldn't be a reason to sort of give
But I'm
up.
not, yeah, please let me explain. I'm not trying for a moment to say we have to give up. What I am saying is that we're chasing an objective which is not feasible, and avoiding the real issue, which is that we need a vast reduction in energy and material throughput in the economy. Various studies suggest we're wasting somewhere between 30 and 50% of our total energy budget right now. So through conservation alone, you'll achieve more than you'll achieve through the vast expenditure in non-existent technologies to achieve net zero.
Okay, and okay, now I follow the question. Apologies, I didn't catch you there. Yeah, no, 100% agreed. Would I'll defer to you about whether conservation efforts would be sufficient to get us there. I think one of the challenges politically, so there's conservation a la support for Canadians to, do an energy efficiency audit on their home. But then there's also, and I think this is what you're pointing to, conservation efforts a la, this is going to require a massive change to people's daily standard of living. And that, I think, is where we could run into some pretty big challenges on the political front in terms of support for, for those sorts of changes.
Okay, good. So John Legg, you're up next, and then Raymond, you're on deck.
Okay, thank you for that talk, Monica, which opens many doors. My question is, since confidence seems to be an important factor in your work, should you not be helping to prepare the oil and gas workforce for transitioning to other work? Now, I know this is a provincial problem mainly, but if the federal government behind the scenes offered some sort of understanding and help, this could be a unifying exercise politically. And we know that Danielle Smith is a spoiler in terms of national unity, but interestingly enough, and this is my last comment, Elizabeth May, it seems to me, highlighted this question in the second of Justin Trudeau's, or possibly the third, federal election. So over to you for that question.
Yeah, so our work doesn't necessarily, sort of roll up its sleeves and engage directly with Canadians, beyond the public opinion survey research. We're, where we would interface with the question that you've raised would be around, okay, so if that's an objective governments want to pursue, what would be the what would be the process that they would need to put in place to to affect that change, and what would be some of the challenges or obstacles that they would likely run into. So one of the studies I didn't get a chance to share with you, but it's noted in the PowerPoint presentation. We, in our work in the sort of 2018 period, we're seeing that the term transition, energy transition, that word, was generating controversy for some people in the network. And so, being academics, we say, okay, so what is going on here? Let's undertake a study to identify why some people are reacting negatively to this term transition. And I am going to get to your question. So we undertook a study where we interviewed over 40 energy and environmental leaders across the country from a variety of different sectors, including oil and gas, to try to understand, what that term meant to them, if they had any challenges with it. And the interesting thing that came out of that study was less about that term transition, although there were some interesting findings there in terms of a lot of folks saying, yeah, we use the term, but we don't always mean the same thing when we're using it. We're sometimes talking at cross purposes, et cetera. But what came out of that study that was much more interesting, and energy and climate experts who've read the study have really appreciated it, is that it laid out that we refer to them in this study as two different realities, that there are two sort of competing realities when it comes to Canada's energy and climate future. And none of our interview participants fit neatly into one or the other of these categories, or these realities, but they would lean more towards one or the other. And so we just called them reality 1 and reality 2. So in reality 1, you have a view that the pace and scale of change should be sort of a sustainable, durable, ongoing progress. That oil and gas will continue to be a part of energy systems for decades to come. So yes, emissions reductions must take place across the energy system, but including in oil and gas production and consumption. But this is predominantly going to be a market-driven process that will reduce emissions over time. That there's a diverse portfolio of energy sources for Canada. So that was folks in the kind of leaning towards that reality. And then other folks would lean towards what we called reality 2, which is rooted in climate science, the climate emergency, that emissions need to be reduced as rapidly as possible, that oil and gas, but in particular oil, should not be part of Canada's energy portfolio in the future, and that this predominantly needs to be a policy-driven transition, with the pace of change being very rapid. And so why am I sharing this with you now, John? Those two realities very frequently are talking past one another in this country. So there would be folks in the oil and gas sector who would say, they firmly believe oil and gas can and should be part of Canada's energy future. It will probably be utilized in energy systems in a different way. Some of it is going to not be used for combustion. It's going to be used for the development of products, whether it's, asphalt or, graphite, carbon, whatever, carbon fiber, whatever. And so a federal government coming in and saying, we're going to, we want to put in place a process to transition oil and gas workers out of that sector, butts up with a worldview and a perception of reality that's very different. And in the absence of navigating those differences in perception deftly, we're going to continue to wind up with a lot of conflict in the country. And you can address that in one of two ways. You can say, okay, maybe the federal government comes in and enforces that, which in some respects I think the government has done in certain areas, like the carbon tax. Says, you know what, we are putting in place a carbon tax. We've now had it go all the way up to the Supreme Court, and has been found to be constitutional. To get to that place, though, John, you might know that took 10 years just to put in place a carbon tax as a result of some of the wrangling and opposition and controversy around it. You know, another approach, and I'm not necessarily advocating for this approach, but another approach is really trying to find out where are there some common areas that the two governments can actually work together. And on the side of those, yes, you know, recognizing that there will be new areas of energy that people in Alberta and other oil and gas producing provinces will move into. So I think where I'm going with this is that, you know, our work would really try to zero in on what are some of the political and social, you know, dimensions of moving forward in a way that will secure confidence of Canadians, you know, across the board in emissions reductions, because we can spend a lot of our time, you know, with not helpful and actually quite destructive conflict that could actually get in the way of progress in areas where there is more areas of agreement. I don't have the answers to this, but those are the kinds of questions that we try to grapple with to try to identify how can we move forward in a way that is, you know, politically, socially sustainable and durable, and get us some durable emissions reductions. It's a fine balance.
I would simply urge you to press more on the policy side by unifying, if you wish, the politically, and cut away any or should I say justification for Danielle Smith to be setting up the federal government as the boogeyman by doing something.
No,
Thank
and I appreciate that comment very much, because certainly, you know, one of the things that we see in our engagement with folks across the country is that, you know, there's what happens in the political talking points and in the sort of high, you know, high level politics between premiers and the prime minister in this particular instance. But there's also what's going on, you know, quote unquote, on the ground when it comes to individual companies and you know, Indigenous communities and others who in many instances are working much more collaboratively with one another than some of those, you know, political exchanges would suggest.
you.
Okay, Raymond. And Raymond, you're up, and then Mary Hegan, you're on deck.
Sorry if I look a bit like a ghost there on the thing. It's not, I assure you, I'm not a ghost. So given that, so I'll read out the question the way I wrote it. So given that many members of your advisory board and much of your funding comes from the oil and gas industry, how can you say that you represent a science-based position and are not simply putting an aura of respectability to what's essentially an oil and gas or essentially oil and gas industry talking points? Now, I ask this in the context of having attended many of your events and having seen some people from the oil and gas industry make some statements that are very, very greenwashy, if I could put it that way. Things like excusing the fact that we still have the highest source of the highest energy intensity oil out in the oil sands, and greenwashing it by saying that, well, emissions were reduced by a tiny bit, so we're better than we were before, but yet we're still the most energy intensive oil production.
Thank you. Thank you for the question and the opportunity to respond. So I think, you know, we as noted when I presented that slide, we have taken great pains actually to have multiple funders for our work. So it's not, you know, exclusively one sector or another sector. Yes, we have oil and gas around the table. We also have electricity around the table, nuclear around the table. We have regulators who have nothing to do with oil and gas around the table. We have federal government, provincial government departments around the table as well. You know, in terms of the funding agreements, they very clearly specify that, you know, this is an academic program. We are undertaking academic research. All of the work that we do goes through the Research Ethics Board at the University of Ottawa. This is, the work that's done is done at an arm's length from the funders. Yes, we have an advisory council, as you noted, but they are just that, an advisory council, not a board giving us marching orders, not at all. So, I take your point and appreciate the question. I think my own view is that we need to have oil and gas, and by we I mean Canada. Needs to have oil and gas at the table in terms of moving forward on emissions reductions. I think the proof, to your point, the proof, Raymond, is going to be in the pudding. I mean, you're probably aware that the largest oil sands producers have come together in the Pathways Alliance, where they've made commitments to net zero. And I think this is where, your comment about greenwashing, the proof will be in the pudding. They've made commitments, and they've made those very publicly, including to shareholders, including to those who are financing their efforts. And so they're going to have to be accountable, for those. So very much appreciate the question.
Okay, thanks. Mary, are you back? If you're back, you're up. And then after that will be Dave Doherty. Mary, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, Monica.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi. Monica, interesting presentation. Early on, you talked about public confidence and community pushback, and that being very relevant to all your research and findings and recommendations to various parties. I need to better understand what recommendations are coming out of your research and your advisory committees and all your opinion polls, read public buy-in to decisions where I'm not feeling they're at the table. And those decisions are often made behind closed doors and then announced. And I'm wondering what your research is telling you as what is needed in the energy system in total to increase this public confidence and trust. Because I agree with you, I suspect to move forward on the future on energy in Canada, that's where the action is really going to be placed.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think I'll answer it in two ways. So, the first would be to say the work that we've done around community involvement or levels of satisfaction with energy project decision making. So I'll run you a little bit through that study and recommendations emerging from that. But I think the really the part of your question I really appreciate, though, is kind of the latter part, which is this isn't just about project by project engagement. It's about what are the decisions that we're taking for the future of our energy systems as a whole. And I think that's, you're giving me some ideas about future projects here, but I think that's where things are absolutely going to have to open up more to involve people in decision making. So starting with the energy project piece. So, and again, I thank you for the question, because it probably or it may have sounded like the only thing we do is study projects that have gone off the rails, which isn't the case. We've also studied projects where things have gone very well and where communities have been satisfied with decision-making processes. So, back to that study I mentioned previously, where we looked at half a dozen major energy projects across the country, some of which went, sideways. So think gas plants in Ontario, a number of years ago, where we had some gas plants that were canceled. And, some of the challenges that happened on the road to that cancellation. We had other projects, though, where things went very well. And I'm thinking in particular of the Wasquatum hydroelectric project in Manitoba, where there is a very unfortunate history in Manitoba, as in many jurisdictions where the Crown Corporation hydropower company, has historically not engaged in any meaningful way with Indigenous communities, has flooded ancestral lands with no engagement, little to no notice. I mean, the stories, people might be aware of them, and they're not stories. The history is really just heart-wrenching. But here we had with the Wasquatum project, a fairly large project. I think it's about 200 megawatts, maybe even a little bit more, where you had a Cree First Nation coming together with Manitoba Hydro to work together on designing the project. So we actually had the chief come to one of our sessions, and he explained the process. And so rather than having, Manitoba Hydro and the First Nation fighting it out in front of a regulator somewhere about, the Manitoba Hydro saying this project should happen and the community saying absolutely not, this is not an appropriate project, they worked together on designing the project. And it actually, what that meant is that the Manitoba Hydro altered the design for the project in terms of where the flooding would take place, in terms of how large the project would be. The impact assessment process was done collaboratively. So rather than Manitoba Hydro doing its own impact assessment and then the First Nation hiring, its firm to do an assessment, they worked together on an impact assessment. So they identified what are the impacts that, together we think are important to be understanding in terms of the implications of this project, work together. So then when they went forward for a regulatory approval of that project, they were going forward as partners in essence. So some of the recommendations that came out of that study, back to your original question, are it's so important that those processes for projects make meaningful space for communities, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, to be involved in the decision making. And that means, properly consulted, having an opportunity to have their say and meaningfully be listened to. One of the recommendations that we made was that no has to be an option. If people's perception is that all projects are going to be approved, the entire process lacks credibility and legitimacy. One of the other recommendations that came out of that study was about information. So yes, communities want information. People want information about individual energy projects that are proposed in their communities. But we developed this tagline of information is a necessary but insufficient condition, right? So frequently, and it just kind of blows my mind sometimes, that folks in industry, their perception is, Mary, if only you understood this project, you would think it's amazing. Well, that's not necessarily the case, right? That communities have different interests, they have different values. There could be, elements of that community that they're not, willing to have impacts to take place on, and that, negotiating some sort of economic benefit actually is not going to be effective. Because the values of the community are taking priority, and that's what's informing people's perceptions and their attitudes about a project. And I think for regulators, then, for those who are actually making decisions about projects, it means that their process for decision making has to be open, inclusive, transparent, representative. It has to make sure that it's got those opportunities for meaningful engagement. And what we heard from a lot of folks was, I can understand there may be a project I disagree with, but at the end of the day, it gets approved. And I can accept that if I felt that the process that was taken to arrive at that decision was an open one, it had credibility, it had legitimacy, and my views were meaningfully heard and considered in that process. But no, still has to be an option. So that's on the project piece. So that would be, sort of a few recommendations that came out, and I'd be happy to provide the KCOR team with a link to that study if you're interested. But on your broader question about, the future, As we are reforming our energy systems, changing the portfolio of energy sources that are providing our energy, as we're moving towards greater levels of electrification, as we're rethinking our economies and just transforming them from an energy perspective, I think it's going to be so crucial to your comment, Mary, that those decisions not be taken behind closed doors. If they're seen to be, lacking transparency, openness, inclusiveness, why would we expect people to accept them? So I think that extending engagement and consultation into the planning process is going to be really, really important.
Okay, Dave, you're up
Well,
next.
I wish you luck in taking that message far and wide and having your research back it up. That's great.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Mary. So Dave, you're up next. And after that, Paul Beckwith, you're on deck.
I have one quick comment and two questions. The first comment is I'm amazed, I guess, at how ahead of its time my grad school was, because the last 5 minutes or so of your answer learned all about it in the late 1970s at grad school. It's amazing to me that we seem not to have learned that as a society.
No.
Anyway, to my questions.
Oh.
To what extent are plans being made to deal with a doubling of Ontario's population by mid-century and a tripling by the end of the century?
So I'll actually go to your comment first, Dave. On the comment, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, this is not, yes, we did new research in this space, but many of these messages and comments have, this research has been, it's been well established in the literature. I mean, my background is in public consultation and engagement. It just sort of blows my mind that we still have, particularly industry, that doesn't necessarily get that, but sometimes governments, unfortunately, as well. But I am going to sidestep your question, your specific questions. I think those are questions for the government of Ontario. To be honest, I don't know the answer to those questions in terms of what has or has not been planned by the government, but I think it's an important question for all governments, frankly, and it has implications, well beyond energy, as you would well know, healthcare, housing. Somebody was mentioning earlier about other priorities.
Indeed. You might ask at the same time, to what extent are plans being made if our population falls in half by then? Which is a distinct possibility.
Yeah, I mean, and where I would go with that, Dave, that many of you in this group would probably be, well aware of foresight analysis and scenario planning and those sorts of tools have unfortunately not, been utilized as much as I think they're going to need to be used going forward, because the two scenarios you lay out, which are both possible, will be radically different in terms of their impacts. And are we planning with that kind of scenario approach in mind? I think we should be.
We certainly should be. So my next question is, some in my extended family just bought a generator because they know the current grid is not reliable. Will the grid ever be reliable again?
Well, I guess the answer to that question is I sure hope so. Certainly our work would point to the absolute crucial, just how crucial it is to have that reliable power, whether it's here in Ontario or in other jurisdictions. And of course, that's related to emissions reductions and ongoing support through the lens of this presentation on emissions reductions, but just, across the board, economically, socially, health, et cetera. I think that the years ahead, my own view is that, and this is a personal view, is that we're underestimating, I'll say many are underestimating the challenges of maintaining that reliability. And so if you look across North America, the number of electricity system operators that are concerned about reliability going forward, whether it's as a result of, different kinds of generating stations coming offline or being refurbished or decommissioned, or because of intermittent renewables and how one handles that, or because of new climate commitments, or because of other factors, cyber. I mean, take your pick. You know, you talk to folks in the sector, reliability is a massive concern in the electricity space. And I think we've to date been relatively fortunate in North America to have very reliable power, and maintaining that going forward will be crucial.
Good, thank you. I might point out, I got 2 minutes after 3, and I know you have some time commitment.
Yeah, so maybe, I'll
I'm
leave it
gonna
to
be
Richard.
replaced by my wife.
I'll leave it to Richard.
So I've got time for one more question, because I've been promising to Paul Beckwith that he's got a question, one last question, sorry. So Paul, can you ask
Yes.
your question?
No.
Yes,
Yeah.
thanks, Monica. So the question I have is, I don't think you've mentioned fossil fuel subsidies at all. You know, we know that Canada is failing miserably in that. Our fossil fuel subsidies are still rising. Just recently, it was reported that the Royal Bank is the bank that has the most subsidies in the world. And, you know, I'm very concerned about the way universities do things now. You know, fossil fuels are being subsidized by the government, and then, you know, on your list of sponsors, people giving you money. You know, I would guess it looks like over half of the funding you get, maybe, I don't know how much, is from fossil fuel companies. So, you know, I don't see your group as an independent organization. You know, Canada has not met a single climate change target. Greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are still rising at record rates exponentially. You know, we can get entire cities like Fort McMurray burning down from wildfires, in extended droughts. And yet we still fund fossil fuel companies. And, you know, why is this? Our government promised that we would not do that. So we don't need any more studies. We don't need any more collaborations, any more groups. We need to actually take action and reduce our emissions. And it's just not happening. So thank you for the presentation, but, you know, I just see everything. I think it's rational for people to disregard governments when they say they're going to do this and that on climate change, because nothing has happened. Emissions could go up and up and up, and Trudeau buys a pipeline company. Biden wants to open up Alaska. It doesn't matter what party's in. Obviously, some political parties are better than others. So we're hitting all of these blocks. So I don't know why the funding that you get doesn't come from the University of Ottawa. Why don't these companies fund the university, and then the individual groups and research departments like your own are getting money from the university pot, which then would make it independent? You know, Ottawa, as far as I know, hasn't divested from fossil fuels. You know, there's no indication that that will happen. So, you know, I just I don't see really what your research is accomplishing with your group.
Thank you again and I appreciate the candor. I would much rather that than, you know, people saying it after I drop off. So thanks very much, Paul, for that. You know, I would love if the university had a grand pot of money and you know, researchers could just dive into it. That there's a certain amount of funding that is available, and we have actually tapped into funding from the University of Ottawa. And I suppose one could say that the fact that my salary comes from the University of Ottawa, I mean, that's how I'm paid. I'm a tenured professor there. You know, so one could say from that perspective that the university is supporting the work, and certainly, you know, a lot of the students that we're supporting are also indirectly being supported by the university as well. I think I already gave the response previously around, you know,
right. So could you just answer, like, have you done any studies on fossil fuel subsidies?
No, that's not an area that we have done any studies
but your
on.
group is positive power, and so much money is going into you know, the power that Canada produces. You know, the fossil fuel industry, the oil sands. It's funding from, you know, that the government promised a decade ago that they'd start phasing out, and that hasn't happened. So, you know, your metric should be CO2 levels in the atmosphere, for example.
Mhm.
You know, I don't know what it's going to take. I mean, like Fort McMurray, you know, just about burned down completely a few years ago.
Yeah,
You
I
know,
mean, I
we're
think
having record, you know, fires once again. It's in the spring in Alberta. You know, it's burning loads of forest. You know, methane isn't being measured across Canada. We trust what the fossil fuel companies say about methane release. So, you know, if you want to really make a difference, do some studies on methane emissions in the Canadian oil and gas industry, you know, and try to get policies to at least block the leaks, et cetera. You know, like some concrete things. We don't need more studies. We don't need to know what the public thinks. You know, we know what the source of the problem is, and we fund it ourselves. I pay taxes. A certain percentage of my taxes fund digging more fossil fuels out of the ground, which end up in the atmosphere and ocean. Right. I'm a climate scientist, and you know, we're going downhill very rapidly. Just last week, we had a talk from a minister, you know, on how to deal with the coming collapse of what we're doing, the way we're doing things. And people are blind in bureaucracies. So, you know, that's a perspective. I really didn't like your comparison of protests on a wind farm or on electrification or on solar farms to the protests against building a new pipeline, for example, because they're totally different things. One of them I see as being a rational protest by people who are scared stiff about the collapse of our planetary systems, our life on Earth. The other one is by people that want to continue business as usual, you know, and build and build and build. If you look at a map of pipelines across North America or the world, for example, we have pipelines everywhere, right? So protesting a few, you know, I don't know. I mean, people are giving up on this. We're going downhill, and climate is taking us out. And you know, here we have a talk, and you know, I highly recommend that you actually participate in some of the future KCOR talks, or at least have one of your grad students do it, or have somebody at the Institute, and you will see how, you know, there's a lot of highly educated people in this group. And we have a lot of very good talks, and I don't, you know, I think people in the Institute need to become a bit more aware of, you know, what's happening.
And it's funny because, Paul, I would say the same thing about, you know, other people would need to become aware of what's happening in other, you know, in other
Right.
ways as well. You know, so we come at this through a social science lens, right? And so it's,
right.
you know, that for folks who are protesting against and opposing a wind farm, you know, I mean, one of the key things that came out of that research study was that for local communities, in many instances, local environmental impacts trump climate impacts. And you can disagree with that, but as a researcher, we're documenting that process, right? And then trying to identify, okay, if that's the case, how do we, and recognizing that we're going to need a lot more, you know, non-emitting energy, how do we then try to, you know, reform our policy and regulatory frameworks to foster the confidence that's going to be needed. You know, there's been a lot of work that's been done, for example, on wind farms in Ontario, and some of the missteps that governments took around those policy frameworks that ended up, you know, creating substantial pushback against renewable power. Like, so that's that, you know, we're coming at it through a social science lens, Paul. So like, I'm not going to be the one that's going to go out there and monitor, you know, methane emissions from the oil and gas. Like, that's not my area of expertise. Can't do that credibly. But I certainly can, you know, with the research that we're doing, identify what are some of the political, social, you know, community obstacles to emissions reductions that you know, from a social science perspective, are going to be just so crucial for us to understand, to actually make progress, you know, on the things that rightly, you're raising.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Well, on that note, I'll ask Jean to wrap up. I know that there are more questions. It's too bad that Monica, you have a hard stop, but there are 2 more questions that people had. But Jean, you're on.
Thank you very much, Richard. And Monica, thank you so much for such an enlightening talk that you've given us today. It is my pleasure to thank you on behalf of KCOR as chairman. It's wonderful to get a different perspective to a degree. We don't have a lot of people who talk about things from the social science perspective. We get a lot more presentations on the science itself. So this has been really an enlightening thing for us. And I know that you are going to have to leave us. So when this particular talk is put up on internet, on YouTube, it will be put up with the chat. And there are other questions that were not asked today that you might be able to look at and go, oh, maybe I should get back to them and sort of look at those too. So for those of you who are still on the line, this particular talk will be on our YouTube channel. If you go to canadiancore.com and sign on to the stay tuned or stay informed section, you will be given the link to this particular talk and to all the other talks that KCOR has done over the last 2.5, 3 years. It is a really invaluable source of information, and all of the videos are searchable. You can see information that has been put up there. I'd also encourage those people who are interested in becoming more active in KCOR to look at our site, become a member, donate to us. All of those are available on our website, canadiancore.com. And again, Monica, thank you very much for a very informative talk.
Thank you, Monica. Have you got time for 2 questions?
No, I'm terribly sorry, but I don't.
Okay.
I will end up being late for another commitment. My apologies. But thank you. I'm really glad to hear that I was just actually looking through some of the questions and comments in the chat. I'm glad that that will be available. And I wanted to thank so much the group for the opportunity to speak to you today. I also wanted to I really want to thank for the candid comments and questions. Much appreciate the opportunity to have those exchanges. So thank you so much again to KCOR, and looking forward to connecting again soon.
Thank you.
All right. Bye for now.
Thank you very much, Monica.
Bye now.
Come back.